Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to SIA to You, which is STEM in Africa's talk show podcast, which helps people learn more about STEM related issues. And today we have an interview with Kate Gouriet, and she's going into her second year of A levels at Benedin School in Kent, England. And we're going to be talking about biology and environmental sciences. So thank you, Kate, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
So the first question that I'm going to ask is, what is climate change?
Okay, so the definition of climate change is a change in global or regional conditions and climate patterns, for example, temperature and rainfall over a long period of time. The common misconception that comes along with climate change is the fact that throughout Earth's history, there have been natural fluctuations in the climate. For example, our last ice age started 2.6 million years ago and lasted around 12,000 years. However, scientists have proved evidence that shows temperatures are now rising faster than previously, and that the rise in global temperature is no longer just natural, it's been enhanced by human activity. So for some background, a key part of climate change is understanding the greenhouse effect, which is a process that's vital for sustaining life on Earth. It keeps the Earth's surface warm so that life can exist. The natural greenhouse effect is when the shortwave radiation emitted by the sun enters the atmosphere and reaches the Earth and warms the surface. This radiation is then reflected from the surface, and most of the long-wave radiation then passes into space as heat, allowing the Earth to cool. However, some long-wave radiation cannot get out of the Earth's atmosphere and is reabsorbed by gases in the atmosphere, known as greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide and methane. The radiation is then re-emitted back to the Earth's surface, causing the surface to warm up. This is the heating that's invaluable to life on Earth. Unfortunately, due to human activity, such as fossil fuel burning and agriculture, increased greenhouse gases have been released into the Earth's atmosphere, causing more radiation to be absorbed and re-emitted, and thus more heat to be retained, resulting in a rise in global temperatures. Therefore, by releasing more of these gases, we are adding to the natural greenhouse effect, which is now referred to as the enhanced greenhouse effect. This is known as global warming, and it is what causes climate change. So what are greenhouse gases? Greenhouse gases, as previously mentioned, are any gases capable of absorbing infrared radiation emitted from the Earth's surface and then radiating it back so that it heats up. The primary greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere are water vapour, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone. The greenhouse gas with the biggest impact on warming is water vapour. However, it only remains in the atmosphere for a few days, and so often people don't really discuss it when talking about climate change and the issues. Carbon dioxide is the most important greenhouse gas. On our planet, there is a process called the carbon cycle, and understanding this is quite an important part of understanding how carbon dioxide affects our atmosphere so much. So the carbon cycle describes the pathway that carbon takes and its transitions between sinks and stores. So a carbon sink is any reservoir that absorbs more carbon than it releases. So it therefore lowers the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And as said before, CO2 is a greenhouse gas, so it causes the warming of our Earth. So globally, the two most important sinks are vegetation and the ocean. However, the capacity of these sinks to sequester carbon is rapidly decreasing due to human activity, and more CO2 is being released into the atmosphere than ever before. Firstly, due to deforestation, so for agriculture, logging, or fuel wood, it decreases the size of forests, which are natural carbon sinks. When trees are cut down, we then lose the carbon stored in the wood, and we lose the carbon stored in the soil as well. So when wood is then burned, more CO2 is released into the atmosphere. However, it can no longer be taken back up as the carbon sink's capacity, the forests, have decreased. The ocean's ability to absorb and store carbon is also decreasing. Roughly 50 to 70% of CO2 is removed by oceans. As waters warm due to rising temperatures, they hold less dissolved CO2. Also, if more carbon dioxide were added to the atmosphere and was to be taken up by the oceans, hydrogen carbonate ion concentration would increase in the oceans, which is an ion which increases its acidity. So calcium carbonate, the compound that makes up shells and skeletons of certain aquatic species, calcium carbonate is broken down by acidic solutions. So therefore, the rise in CO2 endangers ocean species which have these shells or skeletons. Rising surface temperatures may also lead to a slowdown in the thermohaline circulation, which is a global pattern of oceanic flow that partly drives the sinking of surface waters near the poles and is responsible for a lot of the storage of CO2 in the deep ocean. So the slowdown of this flow and this kind of conveyor belt around the world's oceans is due to an influx of melting fresh water, which is caused by a rise in global temperature, into what is usually saltwater conditions. So the whole reason that the salt water sinks is because it's denser than the water coming from the south of the globe. So with fresh water being added to this salt water, it then means that it's less dense. So the water at the poles will, the sinking of the water at the poles will become less efficient, and therefore less CO2 will be transferred from shallower to deeper waters. So ultimately, reduction in the rate of carbon uptake by these reservoirs would increase the pace of CO2 buildup in the atmosphere. Not only a reduction in sinks of carbon are increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, but also human activities such as burning fossil fuels, which takes place in factories and motor vehicles, releasing huge amounts of this greenhouse gas, causing global temperatures to rocket even more. Although carbon dioxide is the most important greenhouse gas, we won't be able to solve the climate crisis, without dealing with other gases too. So the latest modelling shows that the difference between tackling and not tackling non-carbon dioxide gases would add 40 gigatons of carbon to the remaining budget of 1.5 degrees. So that's the world's target of temperature rise is 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's about 4 years worth of today's carbon dioxide emissions. So therefore, we can kind of depict non-carbon gas emissions in terms of the greenhouse gases as being roughly 1/4 of the climate change problem. So then too influential to be ignored, but people often do. So one of these is methane, which is released by the decay of organic matter from waste in landfill sites, animal manure, and large areas of crops. Nitrous oxides are produced by burning fossil fuels and the use of artificial fertilizers.
Yeah, that was a great answer. I think it was great that it was really descriptive, because a lot of people get confused between the difference in like climate change, global warming, and like what constitutes each of it. So another question that I think is really important, it's twofold, but what is Africa's biggest contribution to global warming, and how do you think global warming will affect African countries?
Okay, so Africa is actually not a huge contributor to global warming. So sub-Saharan Africa is responsible for just 7.1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, despite being home to 14% of its people. So therefore, most African countries do not emit that much carbon dioxide. However, the carbon dioxide emissions, most are stemming from the burning of fossil fuels and the manufacture of cement, as well as some chemical firms. And then how will it affect African countries? So everywhere in the world will be affected by climate change, ranging from a lack of biodiversity to extreme weather events to drought and lack of water and change in ecosystems and increase in diseases. But in terms of Africa specifically, it's actually a particularly vulnerable region in regards to the effects of climate change. Like many other continents, a wide range of impacts are faced, including increased drought and floods, a decrease in food production and inundation of its coastal zones and deltas, spread of waterborne diseases and risk of malaria, changes in natural ecosystems and loss of biodiversity. The reasons that Africa is particularly vulnerable and will be so heavily affected is, firstly, a lot of the livelihoods are closely coupled with the climate system. So For example, hundreds of millions of people depend on rainfall to grow their food, which could lead to greater food insecurity in terms of the difference between industry in different countries. Secondly, the African climate system is controlled by an extremely complex mix of large-scale weather systems, and much of this has yet to be understood as it is vastly understudied. Therefore, many unexpected things could happen, and ones that governments aren't necessarily prepared for, like floods or droughts, just extreme weather events, particularly in the African region. A lot of these weather patterns are hard to follow and measure, and a lot of them just haven't been studied at all. So there's a big aspect of uncertainty there. Thirdly, the degree of expected climate change is very large in Africa. So the two most extensive land-based projected decreases in rainfall on the planet are over Africa. So one over the north and one over the south. For example, for the decades after the 1960s and peaking in the 1984, there was a 30% decrease in rainfall across the Sahel. And this has led to famine, deaths, and displacement of millions. So no other region has documented such a long and sparsely extensive drought. So this alteration in the monsoon system is thought to be caused by aerosol pollution, which cooled parts of the global ocean, affecting the weather system. So as I said before, with the thermohaline belt, all of this kind of comes together under the increasing global temperatures. In southern Africa, we're seeing a delay in the onset and a drying of early summer rains, which is only predicted to worsen. Temperatures are predicted to rise by 5 degrees or more in parts of Namibia, Botswana, and Zambia. However, in East Africa, scientists have identified a problem termed the East African climate paradox, and it's where long rains from March to May are predicted to start later and end sooner, similarly to what will be predicted for Southern Africa. However, it's also predicted that in this period, the rains will cause more flooding because it's more concentrated. So there'll just be, as said before, just an increase in extreme weather events. And then Central Africa is also close to a rainfall minimum, which is needed to support the world's second largest rainforest system. And finally, the capacity to adapt to climate change is low due to high rates of poverty. There is reduced choice at individual level, as well as a lack of prioritization of climate change by governments and the need to act. Unfortunately, with the climate change crisis, a lot of the mechanisms that need to happen are just more accessible by developed countries. So it's a very kind of polarizing issue.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting to hear about, because most of Africa are developing nations, it's very interesting to hear about their contribution to what many believe is a first world problem, when really, like, climate change and global warming affects the whole world. The last question I have for you is, what do you think that we can do all over the world on a day-to-day basis to fight climate change?
Okay, so there's lots of things that we can do on a day-to-day basis, and a lot of it obviously depends on where you live and what region you are in, and the policies and your particular government. But in terms, so I'll start with food. So at a global level, the 5 things that will help the most are a change in dietary trend to less meat and dairy, limits to first and second generation biofuel, so to take the pressure off the agricultural system and allow development of agriculture practices that support biodiversity. So biofuel is basically when you burn crops or food to create fuel. However, it's extremely inefficient and it actually wastes a lot of food. We can also have improved targeting and efficiency of fertilizer, pesticide, and water, elimination of phosphates from detergents, and greater establishment of protected areas inland, sea, and freshwater. But at a personal level, in terms of food, if we buy and eat food in ways that enable a biodiverse agricultural system, so this means less beef and lamb, less waste, and keeping fish consumption modest, most importantly, to always eat from sustainable sources. Also, find out more about your supply chains. So try to restrain from buying from companies that have a large carbon footprint. The companies that use antibiotics in farming, because often farmers use antibiotics to prevent disease rather than cure disease, and this then increases antibiotic resistance, which is another huge problem and probably another talk. So yeah, that it increases that, and also ones that don't use deforestation. Aim to support companies that maximise biodiversity and quality of employment. Of course, as much as climate change is important, there are also other considerations that need to be taken into account, including respect for people who are involved. So, because it could affect people's livelihoods, communities and traditions. But ultimately, we need fewer farmed animals, less crop-based animal feed. We need to be more careful with fertilisers and antibiotics and maintain biodiversity as much as we can. On the positive side, sustainable food and land systems require a greater workforce due to more care, skill and effort needed to take to look after the land sustainably. So it will actually create a huge net livelihood opportunity. In terms of transport, it's a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So where possible, try to use public transport in day-to-day lives or use environmentally friendly modes of transport such as the bike. In terms of waste, different regions have different waste issues. So in terms of agriculture in Africa, most losses take place during harvesting and subsequent storage rather than at a household level. But we just almost try our best to reduce food waste as much as possible. And if there's surplus food left over that you can't finish, give it to a friend or a neighbour. The worst place for food waste to go is landfill sites, as it generates more methane, which is a toxic greenhouse gas, as mentioned before. And not only with food, but with all other waste as well, we must try to recycle as much as and as often as we can. In terms of energy, we need to both leave the fossil fuel in the ground and grow a clean energy supply to replace it, because fossil fuels produce huge amounts of greenhouse gases. So, but we can't expect the growth in green energy to stop the use of fossil fuels. It's got to be both at the same time. In terms of clean energy mechanisms, currently there's solar power, which is the best option. Then there's wind and hydro power, which are useful but more limited. Nuclear power is very risky, and biofuels are probably the worst because they threaten the global food supply and biodiversity, because like forests and rainforests are then chopped down to grow crops purely to produce more energy, and ultimately you're just reducing the carbon sinks again and releasing more CO2 into the atmosphere. So we need to find more energy efficient products, and on a day-to-day basis, what people can do is vote for politicians who both understand the issues and prioritize them. So, and if there's none that do this, then just vote to who comes closest. So we want to vote politicians that take into account the climate crisis, but also in terms of energy options for the country, because that is a huge part of the country's total emissions. Where you can, support energy efficient supply chains, low carbon technologies and infrastructure, especially if you're part of a company. Encourage it to support and invest those businesses who are aiming to be more sustainable. And then using gas as a source of energy is better than burning kerosene, wood or coal for the environment. So LPG stoves, liquid petroleum gas stoves, are more environmentally friendly as they have targeted heat and turn on and off, whereas firewood burns really inefficiently, which means that you have to burn a lot more wood for the same amount of energy produced by the stove. It also releases methane and black carbon, which causes indoor air pollution and respiratory diseases, as well as causing deforestation. So therefore, where possible, try to invest in more energy efficient products such as LPG stoves or clean cook stoves. You can also lobby the government to expand the grid and invest more in electricity, as electricity usage is far more environmentally friendly than individual generators that use coal and diesel. And as electronic devices become more and more available and a greater part of all our lives, we need to bear in mind the effects each action has on the environment. We need to try to cut down our energy footprint as much as possible and try to support more energy efficient machinery, as well as help others to become more aware of their energy usage and other issues that they can tackle to bring the topic to light. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the facts and figures and to feel as though as an individual you can't do much to help the situation and the global crisis we're in. but we need to think of the response to climate change as a big systemic challenge, and take personal action as being all about influencing the whole system. So ultimately, it's up to everyone to do their best in any way they can to help tackle this global crisis.
Thank you. But thank you so much, Kate, for everything that you shared, because I'm pretty sure that a lot of people are going to learn a lot from you. And for somebody who's still only in school, like most of us, you have a lot of knowledge that's great to share about such an important issue. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Immunity is defined to be the ability of an organism to resist particular infection or toxin by the action of specific antibodies or sensitized white blood cells. But what does this mean? First of all, in order to understand immunity, we need to understand how the human body defends itself against harmful disease-causing microorganisms called pathogens. These can be bacteria, fungi, protoxis, or viruses. Pathogens need an organism to live in. When a pathogen has passed the primary defences, for example our skin, which acts as a barrier to prevent the entry of pathogens, it enters the organism and the organism is said to be infected. An organism in which a pathogen lives is called a host. The pathogen lives by taking nutrition from the host, and this is what can be harmful. So what happens once the pathogen has entered our bodies and passed the primary defences? All microorganisms and cells have little protein markers on their surface. Imagine them as little spikes, and each cell has unique ones. They are specific to that organism, a bit like our fingerprints. These chemical markers are called antigens. So, when a pathogen invades our body, it detects the antigens on its surface and recognises them as foreign. They are different from any of those in our body. The body therefore knows that this is an invader. It is not supposed to be here. In our blood and tissue fluid are cells called white blood cells. These help defend against pathogens and aim to destroy them. There are different types of specialised white blood cells. The two main groups are phagocytes and lymphocytes. There are two types of phagocytes, neutrophils and macrophages, and there are two types of lymphocytes, B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. Next comes the secondary non-specific defence. It defends against all pathogens, not a specific one, and happens whenever our body is infected, which is why it is referred to as non-specific. The first line of secondary defence is phagocytosis. This is carried out by the phagocytes, which engulf and digest the pathogens. This is why they are sometimes called the big eaters. Neutrophils will bind to the antigens on the surface of the pathogen and then fold around the pathogen to engulf it. This process is called endocytosis and forms what is known as a phagosome. Once it has trapped the pathogen inside of it, it uses proteins called enzymes to break it up and destroy it. After the pathogen has been digested, the harmless products can be absorbed into the cell. After this, a specific immune response is launched. This is a response that is specific at targeting that unique pathogen. Macrophages, a type of phagocyte, play an important part of initiating this response. Like the neutrophils, they engulf and destroy the pathogen. However, there is a key difference. When they engulf it, they do not fully destroy it. The antigens, the little protein markers on the surface of that pathogen, are kept and the macrophages move them onto its own surface. It has now become an antigen-presenting cell. By placing the pathogen's antigens on its own surface, it exposes the antigen and moves around the body where it can come into contact with other cells in the immune system that can recognise the foreign antigen and start a full immune response. The specific immune response involves B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. In order to start the immune response, the specific antigens on the surface of the pathogen must be detected by the B and T lymphocytes. These lymphocytes also have proteins on their surface. These are known as receptors. These receptors are complementary to the shape of the antigen. Imagine it being like a lock and a key. The antigen on the pathogen is the key, and it fits into the receptor on the lymphocyte, which is the lock. Because the receptor has a specific shape, which makes that unique antigen exactly. These lymphocytes come into contact with the antigens, either by the action of the antigen-presenting cell, so the macrophages which have brought the pathogen antigen to its surface, or by direct contact with them in the blood. The reason why the antigen-presenting cells are needed is that it has to be the specific lymphocyte that matches the antigen that is selected, and there may only be one singular lymphocyte that matches it in our blood. So by moving around our body, the antigen-presenting cells increase the likelihood of the right lymphocyte coming into contact with the antigen. The contact between the correct lymphocyte and the antigen of the pathogen is known as clonal selection. The next stage is clonal expansion or proliferation. This is when the correct lymphocyte that has been activated increase in numbers. They divide by a process called mitosis, forming exact replicates of themselves in order to become effective and defeat the pathogen. They need to be exact copies because, remember, only the lymphocytes which have the receptors on their surface that match the antigens can bind to the pathogens and destroy them. The last stage is differentiation, where all these many cells that have just been produced become specialised to form useful cells. So T lymphocytes, the correct one that has been selected, develop into 4 different types. These are T killer cells, T memory cells, T helper cells, and T regulator cells. B lymphocytes develop into 2 different types, plasma cells and B memory cells. T killer cells attack infected host cells. So when a pathogen has infected one of our cells, their antigens are displayed on the surface of our cells, a bit like the antigen-presenting cells. And the lymphocytes recognise this as the foreign antigen they are trying to destroy, so the T killer cells attack them. T helper cells send chemical signals to B lymphocytes to stimulate the correct B lymphocyte, the one which has the matching receptor, to divide in order to speed up the process. Plasma cells make antibodies. Antibodies are proteins that are specific to the antigen, just like the receptors. They are called immunoglobulins, meaning they are complex proteins produced by the plasma cells in an immune response. Part of them has a specific shape which is complementary to that of the particular antigen, so that it can bind to it, just like the lock and key analogy mentioned earlier. The plasma cells must create one type of antibody for each antigen that is detected, because each is individual and has a specific shape. There are many different types of antibodies, but all share the same aim, to bind to the antigens on the pathogen in order to make them harmless. For example, some, called opsonins, bind to the antigens so that the phagocytes, which engulf the pathogens, can detect them more easily and therefore more easily engulf and destroy them. Once the antibodies have neutralised the antigens and the pathogen has been destroyed, the T regulator cells help to end the immune response, and the number of antibodies in the blood decreases. We have had the primary immune response. However, there are no longer any more antibodies in the blood, which means that if the body was infected a second time by the same pathogen, the antibodies to destroy it would have to be made again. This is where the B and T memory cells play their part. The memory cells that were produced during the primary immune response remain in the blood for several years afterwards and provide long-term immunity. This is because if the same pathogen infects again, these cells will be circulating in the blood and will be able to recognise the specific antigens more quickly, causing a full immune response much faster. Therefore, more antibodies are produced and much sooner, enabling the pathogen to be destroyed quickly, enough for the organism that has been infected not to show symptoms or feel ill. This is the secondary immune response and is provided by the immunological memory of the lymphocytes. Therefore, immunity is achieved. The organism is able to resist the infection and can destroy the pathogen. There are 4 different types of immunity. However, we can make two distinctions between these types. First of all, immunity is either active or passive. Active immunity is achieved when the immune system is activated and creates its own antibodies. Passive immunity is when antibodies are provided from another source. For example, a vaccination. The antibodies are given to us instead of our body having to make them. Secondly, immunity can be natural or artificial. Natural immunity is when the immunity is achieved through normal life processes. So when we are infected by a disease, unintentionally in our everyday lives. Artificial immunity is achieved through medical intervention. We are purposefully exposed to the pathogen to achieve immunity, which is the case with the vaccine. From these distinctions, we get 4 types of immunity. First, natural active immunity. This is when immunity is provided by antibodies made in the immune system as a result of infection. A person suffers from the disease and is then immune. For example, a disease like chickenpox. Secondly, we have artificial active immunity. Here, immunity is provided by antibodies made in the immune system as a result of vaccination. A person is injected with a weakened, dead, or similar pathogen, or with an antigen, and this activates a specific immune response. For example, like the vaccinations we get against the flu. Thirdly, natural passive immunity. In this case, it refers to babies or fetuses. Antibodies are provided via the placenta or breast milk, which makes the baby immune to the disease the mother is immune to. This is crucial for the baby's first year of life, as its immune system is still developing and so needs to help with preventing infections. It is a natural process, however, it isn't the baby's immune system that is activated, it is the mother's, which is why it's passive, not active, but is still natural. Lastly, we have artificial passive. This is immunity provided by injection of antibodies made by another individual. This happens with hepatitis A and hepatitis B vaccines, which are infections in the liver. In order to strengthen our immunity, other than by getting vaccinations and becoming immune to specific pathogens, on a day-to-day basis, we can eat a diet with lots of fruits and vegetables, exercise regularly, maintain a healthy weight, avoid smoking as well as drinking alcohol, and getting adequate sleep. All of these contribute to remaining as healthy as possible and looking after our bodies, which will help to maximise our immunity and prevent infection and diseases. The difference in immunity between different demographics changes with the specific disease. However, one key change is with age. Researchers have claimed that the immune system deteriorates with age due to studies done on mice. And we have seen recently with COVID-19 that this clearly is the case and that the older demographic tend to be affected more by the virus. So with this study, they reported that as an individual ages, infection and cancer become more common, which suggests that there is an impairment of immunity as we get older. The exact reason is unclear. However, one theory is that aging leads to reduced ability to overcome viral infections. The results from the experiment showed that this may actually be because the immune system almost overreacts and creates inflammatory pathways that cause susceptibility to viral infections, making them more likely. They came to the conclusion that, in fact, it was a heightened immune response rather than defective immunity that had attacked the body and led to disease in the older population. However, these studies were on animals and therefore no final conclusions can be made in relation to humans. However, this is the best theory that they have so far, and it was researched in 2009. So, first of all, to discuss the importance of vaccinations, we need to understand them. So, what is a vaccine? A vaccination is a way of stimulating an immune response so that we achieve immunity to a specific disease. As explained previously, it is an example of artificial active immunity. The immune response is started by exposing the body to the antigens of the pathogen that we are trying to gain immunity to. The antigenic material, which can vary from a dead or weakened strain of the pathogen to the antigens themselves, are usually injected into our bloodstream, but sometimes they can be taken orally. The immune system then recognises these antigens as foreign and treats it as if it were a real disease, thus starting a specific immune response, creating antibodies, and ultimately memory cells that provide the long-term immunity, as explained previously. Vaccinations are important because they provide us with immunity to pathogens which could cause disease and could damage us. There are different applications of vaccinations, one being of great importance, which is herd vaccination. Herd vaccination is using a vaccine to provide immunity to almost all the population at risk. It runs on the principle that if the majority of people at risk are vaccinated, let's say between 80 and 90%, it will protect other people in the population that either haven't been vaccinated because they don't have access to the vaccines or because they haven't consented to being vaccinated, or for those whom the vaccination has not worked, which can happen because the disease can no longer be spread. Therefore, it will protect them. There won't be a high enough infection rate for people who haven't been vaccinated or who haven't contracted immunity from the vaccine to be affected by it. Ring vaccination is another application of vaccines, and this is when a new case of disease is reported and all the people close to and surrounding the new case are vaccinated in order to contain the disease and stop it to continue spreading. So, for example, if the centre of a town had a new outbreak of a disease, the surrounding houses or the surrounding town would be vaccinated to try and contain the spread and stop it from spreading even more. So, vaccines are also of great importance in the control of epidemics and, of course, pandemics. Once a vaccine has been developed for an infectious disease, it will eradicate the incidences of infections and stop it from spreading. Currently, the concept of vaccinations and their importance are prevalent and extremely crucial if we are to overcome COVID-19 and end the global pandemic, as we want to protect everybody from contracting the disease.